He will have 15 to 20 minutes to make his presentation. At the end of that time, the panel will deliberate and the audience will be asked to leave the room. Please do not leave the room before I dismiss you. And Peter's worked very hard on this presentation, so please give him your respect and attention.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my senior exhibition. So I'd like to start it off with my essential question. How will building a boat help me become more independent? And so why did I choose this project? So I grew up on an island called ISLESFORD. It's just a couple miles away from here. And I've spent tons of time on the water. I've grown up lobstering. My dad's a lobsterman, fishing, all sorts of just hanging around on the water. So I definitely have a strong connection to the ocean. But one particular experience last summer influenced me a lot to choose this project. So I've been lobstering ever since I was 8 years old, and whenever I'm lobstering, it's always on a boat with a loud engine and the haulers pulling up traps, and it's making loud screeching noises, and I always wear earplugs. And pretty much as soon as I step on my boat in the morning, I just put my head down and I work all day, and then I just get off the boat and go home. But so one time, some friends were up on the island, and I was like, you know, my friend has a sailboat, we should go out for a sail. And they were like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And so we went and sailed for like 2 or 3 hours, and it had to be like, it was one of the most amazing experiences that I've ever had. It was just being on the water in complete silence. All you can hear is just the wind and the rushing of the water. Just the power of silence during that time, and just feeling like the physics of the wind through the sails was just truly amazing. But also, maybe something even more important influenced this decision to build a boat, and that's this program called ISLESFORD BOATWORKS. So ISLESFORD BOATWORKS started off as a youth nonprofit organization. Just so every summer we build a boat from start to finish, but now we actually have expanded our programs to include teens and adults. So every summer, youth, teens, and adults are all working together to build this boat that we have a big launching party for at the end of the year. So throughout this whole process, the students are learning traditional hand tool and power tool skills, just learning more about these traditional boat designs that we're building. And it's also just a chance to bring the community together. There's times where we just have, you know, community jam sessions where everyone brings in an instrument, and we have one half of the barn music and one half of the barn boat work, and it's just a really good community experience. So I've been in BOATWORKS ever since it started. This is me in BOATWORKS in 2006 as a 7-year-old, and this is me on the right in BOATWORKS last summer. I worked my way up from the youth to the teen program, and now I'm an instructor there. So in the youth program, I mostly spent my time developing tool skills. I was mostly work with an instructor who would basically tell me what to do, and they're like, okay, I need you to put this nail in, or plane this block of wood, or something like that. And the team program was a little bit more experimental. I worked on a lot of independent projects where I could basically build whatever I wanted. And I built a few boxes, and I spent a lot of time building skateboards, which is a big hobby of mine for a while. And now what I do at BOATWORKS is I'm an apprentice instructor. And so I basically, pretty much teaching these skills that I've learned over the years. But throughout this whole time that I've been in BOATWORKS, I haven't actually been on like the team of individuals who get together and actually figure out how the boat is put together. I've mostly just focused on the tool skills part. So I do have a lot of skills, just woodworking skills, but I've never really actually sat down independently and tried to figure out how to build a boat. And so I thought this project would be a great idea, great way to take these skills that I've learned and kind of put them to the test while also developing some new independent thinking skills. And so my primary inspiration for what boat to actually build was this one design that we did in BOATWORKS As you can see, it's just an incredibly beautiful boat. And so I started doing a lot of research as to what this design actually is. So I started my research from this website called Gentry Custom Boats, which is just a custom boat website. And I learned that this design is called skin on frame. It's very intuitive. Basically, you have some sort of wooden frame and then a waterproof skin wrapped around the outside. This creates a super strong design that's also waterproof. And this design is super, super old. The Inuits first used it. They made kayaks with this. They would either make the frame out of wood or whale bones, and then they would wrap the outside in a seal skin. And so what geodesic aerolite does, which is the name of this design that I chose to build, and actually the guy who started this company is from Wiscasset, Maine. He takes this traditional design and incorporates modern materials into it. And so these modern materials are Kevlar and Dacron. Kevlar, some of you may know, is what they make bulletproof vests out of. It has an incredible tensile strength, which means it's very resistant to any sort of pulling motion. So what you do is you basically wrap the entire hull in Dacron and then tighten it up a ton. And so you don't have to use as much wood, but you have an incredibly strong, rigid frame. And then the Dacron is very similar to a sail material. It's very easy to use because all you have to do is tape it along the edges of where you want the material to be, and you can use a heat gun or a hairdryer to heat shrink the fabric and make a super tight skin. And then all you need to do is just add some sort of waterproofing agent to it. And so the actual boat design that I chose is called the Blivet 13. It's comparable to a 420 if some of you are familiar with the boats that the high schoolers use in racing at the sailing center. So it's a comfortable boat for just cruising around, but it also has some performance aspects as well. Also, it's one of the more challenging designs that they have on the Geodesic Aerolite website. It's estimated that this project would take me about 200 hours to complete. But by far the most shocking statistic is that this boat only weighs 60 pounds, but it has a capacity of 700 pounds. So you can sail about 4 to 5 people in it, but it only takes 1 or 2 to lift it. And so Mr. Deans, who's the shop teacher here, directed me towards my mentor, Rich Helmke. Some of you may know Henry Helmke, his son. He's the owner of Bass Harbor Boat Shop, and he has years and years of experience. So my initial expectations going into this project was that I was going to commute to ISLESFORD every day and use the BOATWORKS shop. So I was going to commute after school. I had senior privileges, so I'd get there by about 1. And then I'd work for 3 hours and then take the boat home. And at this rate, 200 divided by 3 is about 66 days. So it'd take me 3 or 4 months to complete. So I soon realized that the BOATWORKS barn was not a possibility. It has all the tools that I could ever want. It has huge power tools that are super expensive and tons of space, but it would have been too much of a hassle just to try to take a boat out there every day. And it's just too much with all the other stuff going on in my schedule. Also, it only has a small fireplace in the shop. And when you're building a boat, you really need consistent heating throughout the entire workspace, especially for glue, when you're gluing. And so I eventually decided to work in my garage. So this is great because I could work whenever I wanted to. It has a great heating system, but the only drawback is that I had a limited amount of tools to work with. Obviously I couldn't lug like a huge, gigantic table saw over by boat or something like that. And so I was basically limited to what I could hold in my hand for a tool. And I also soon realized that I wasn't going to finish this project before first semester. It was just not a reasonable goal to work on the boat 3 hours every day. So one of the first things that I had to decide was what wood to use on this boat. So I met with my mentor, and I also gained some experience from my dad and this book called Building Small Boats by Greg Rossell. So there's 4 different types of wood that I used for my project. The first one is white oak and mahogany. 2 very similar woods. They're both super dense and strong, but they are heavy. So I mostly use these woods for critical areas where you just need a piece of wood that's not going to move and that's not going to be damaged in any way. The next type of wood was marine plywood, and so this is a super light, strong, and thin plywood, but it is very expensive, so I had to use it sparingly. Plywood is great for any sort of siding or bottom of a vessel. So I used plywood for the bottom of my boat, just because with a sailboat you need that extra weight on the bottom, and so I didn't use the entire Dacron all around. The third type of wood is Douglas fir. This is a very just versatile wood. It's super straight grained, which means that you can buy it in like 14-foot planks, and there's not a whole lot of twists or knots in the wood. So it's great for all of like the long pieces that I needed to stretch from like bow to stern of the boat, which are very thin. And so it's overall just kind of an average wood. And the last type of wood that I used was called northern white pine. Basically just I used this for any piece that wasn't really structurally important. It's pretty weak, but it's very easy to work with, so I used it for a lot of filler pieces. And so here's a diagram of the boat. As you can see up there, that kind of circle piece and the triangle piece up front I made out of white oak. That circular piece is called the mast step. It's where the mast slides into. And then I used mahogany for that kind of rectangular piece in the very center of the boat. It's called the daggerboard well. Some of you may know with sailboats that you need some sort of wood structure to hang out the center of the boat to keep it from tipping over while you're sailing. So that's where the daggerboard slides into. And then I used plywood for the bottom and then this sort of back seat area. And I used fir for those long pieces of wood that you can see stretch from bow to stern, and also these vertical pieces all along called the frames. And then I used pine for those filler blocks in between those long pieces of wood. And so when I started the building process, I started on January 9th. So during the first 2 months of the project, I spent this time setting up shop, and then I had the stations in place. The stations are these pieces of wood that actually aren't part of the finished boat, but they hold all of the long strips of wood in place when you're gluing them. And then I had the stem, which is the very front of the boat, and the transom, which is the very back of the boat. And I also had the longitudinal members cut out, which are those long strips of wood. And from March 1st to April, to about mid-April, I spent this time fitting all of these long strips of wood and basically getting the skeletal framework of the boat and getting everything ready for the bottom to be put on. And then from mid-April to early May, I put the bottom of the boat on. This was a super tricky process because, as you can see in the photo on the left, like the piece of wood tapers, but it also twists a ton, and it had to fit into this very delicate slot in the other pieces of wood. So there wasn't a ton of room for error, and like I said, the wood was very expensive, so I wasn't really able to use another piece if I messed one up. And all throughout May, I've been getting all of the other wood pieces ready in order to put the outside skin on. And right now, what I'm doing is I'm finishing the boat with epoxy and varnish, basically protecting it from the elements. And I'll get into what epoxy and varnish is. So I learned this knowledge from my boat plans, also my dad, who has had a lot of boat building experience. So epoxy is basically a 2-part chemical system. You have 2 different liquids, one is a resin and one is a hardener. And when you put them together, it creates this super, super strong chemical bond that is insanely durable and super waterproof. So I used, when I was using epoxy, I added a filler to it, which makes it a super, super strong glue. But you can also use it for a clear coat, but the only disadvantage of epoxy is that it's not UV resistant, so if it's baking in the sun for a long time, then it's going to break down really easily. And so that's where varnish came into play, because varnish is a combination of liquids. It's great as a clear coat because it is UV resistant, but the only downside with varnish is that it's not quite as durable as epoxy, so you have to kind of recoat it every year. And so the next steps for my project, I have to finish varnishing the boat, and then I have to install the Kevlar and the Dacron, and then the rub rails in the outer keel, which are basically pieces of wood that protect the boat from scuffs and dings and collisions and stuff like that. And then the very final step is installing all of the rowing and sailing rigging, basically getting this boat transportable in the water. And so throughout this whole process, I've learned a ton about boat building. Like I showed you guys, I learned a lot about epoxy and different kinds of wood, but I've also gained a lot of understanding of just the different parts of the boat and how they all fit together. And I've learned a lot about independent boat building, kind of strategizing. I remember in the beginning of the project, I would just spend sometimes even like an hour just staring at the boat plans, trying to figure out how to do something. And I noticed at the end I had sort of a mental strategy to kind of like figure out how I was going to put something together. And so to address my essential question, I learned a couple things that I think teens particularly struggle with, making phone calls and time management. So just generally, I had to order a lot of stuff for my project, and one thing that I had to learn was just to ask for help, especially when I was trying to pick out some different types of wood or something like that. Also, time management was a huge hump that I had to get over. I noticed that at the beginning I had a lot less motivation, especially because it didn't quite look like a boat yet. But as it went on, I kind of got better at just putting the pedal to the metal and just doing it. And I also learned a lot about taking on big projects in general. So I've roughly calculated that I've spent about 120 hours on this project since January 9th, which is about an hour per day. And so throughout this whole time, I've really had to keep things in perspective. Senior stress was a huge problem for me. I had scholarships to work on and all sorts of college things to fill out, and also just other school stuff that I really had to balance my time with. And sometimes I had to realize that, I've got so much stuff to do, it's okay to put the boat on the back burner just for a couple days while I get this thing done. And so another thing was just really getting in the work zone. Even when I was in the work zone, I really had to figure out how to organize my time. So I would be like super motivated to work on my boat, and all I wanted to do was get it done. But I really had to figure out okay, well, yes, working on your boat is important, but you have other things that need to get done as well. So I also had a lot of conflicts with my fishing season. I'm a lobsterman, so springtime is huge for getting traps ready and getting my own fishing boat ready. So that kind of conflicted with my senior X schedule a lot. And maybe the biggest thing that I learned from this project is to not be independent when I'm taking on independent projects. So when I first started receiving help from my dad, when I was gluing the longitudinal members together, because I needed one person to hold the wood while I was working on the piece, fitting it and gluing it at one end. And I noticed that I had a lot of glue projects, and I would usually ask my dad for help. And I realized that during these times, it was just such a big motivation to have someone else working on the project with you. And I definitely would not have gotten as far as I did. Even though I didn't finish the boat in time for this presentation, I got so much more done than I would have on my own. And so I'm definitely going to use this knowledge to tackle big projects in the future. I know that my lobster boat projects are never going to end. There's always going to be stuff to do. I'm hopefully going to be involved with BOATWORKS for the rest of my life, and maybe I'll build more boats on my own. So these kind of time management, organization skills are really going to help me out with those. Also, just ISLESFORD BOATWORKS in the future. These new boat building skills are going to allow me to be a bigger asset to the program, and I'm probably going to be just working my way up through the ranks, and hopefully being like in a director's position or something like that with BOATWORKS in the future. So at this time, I'd like to thank my mentor, Rich, for really helping me a lot with some of the decisions I had to make. I'd like to thank my dad a lot. I relied on help from my dad more than I did with Rich, because if I wanted to get something glued in, it was kind of tricky to be like, hey Rich, can you drive all the way from Bass Harbor to Northeast Harbor to help me like put this thing on? And so it was often easier, since my dad already has some boat building experience, just to be like, hey Dad, could you just help me out for like 5 minutes here? So that was really helpful. And I'd also like to thank the MBI Education Enhancement Fund for giving me a grant of $500. That was a huge help. And I'd also like to thank Tony Archino, who is the BOATWORKS director. He's agreed to help me kind of wrap up the last couple things that I need to do to get my boat finished. And I'd also like to thank Miss Dillon, my Senior X teacher, for sort of guiding me along through the beginning parts of this project. And these are my sources.
At this point, the panel will ask questions, and following the panel's questions, we'll open it up for some short questions from the audience, and then I'll dismiss the audience. So the panel has questions.
Are you still planning on finishing the boat?
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, so I have about 80 hours technically on the boat. So.
Are you planning on finishing the boat before you get to dig into the lobstering this year?
Well, I'm already kind of pretty deep in the lobstering.
Before you get any deeper?
No, because I've kind of realized that like I have to pay for college, so I've kind of justified it, like the boat is on the back burner for right now, and I need to focus on paying for school. So, but hopefully I'll be able to get it done this summer. That's my goal.
A lot of students struggle with procrastination as they're approaching their senior X. And you talked about, you learned a lot about time management, but was just plain old procrastination an issue, or are you always pretty industrious and needed to figure out how to allocate your time to other, you know?
I think procrastination was more of a problem in the beginning.
Yeah.
I think probably because I was mostly working very much on my own, and it was a lot of the things that I had to do was like getting the station set up, where I had to do like a lot of like making sure everything is lined up perfectly, and it wasn't like the fun part for me, which is putting the pieces together. So I think it was more just about where I was at in the boat building process that helped me get through that procrastination.
And did you have to make a lot of compromises? Like using more glue than wood in some places, or like to deal with errors? Did you compromise from your ideal? Or?
Yeah, I had quite a few errors. So actually I could show you a picture of one of the areas that I kind of messed up on. So if you can see right here, this like these two strips of wood come in and meet. They're actually not supposed to meet. This one, the inside one's supposed to run straight. So I squeezed them too much together when I shouldn't have. And it does have some sort of visual effect, but it doesn't really have a structural effect. So a lot of the things, like a lot of the times I would mess something up, and then my dad would just be like, you know, it's gonna be like, it is where it is, like it's still gonna float, so it's like, it's fine.
So I'm assuming the 500 wasn't enough for this project. Did you spend some of your own money? And
yeah.
And then what do you plan on doing with the boat when it's completed?
Well, that is also another thing that I didn't really plan out a lot, because one of the big questions I have to ask now is like, where am I going to keep this thing? So hopefully I can find a space at BOATWORKS. They have space there, but I might be able to try to find a place. I have a barn at my house, so I might be able to store it there. But I hope to sail it a lot.
Did you make the thing to put in the boat?
The what?
Do you know the little cap you have up there?
Yeah.
Did you make the thing that goes into the boat to make sure it's balanced so it won't keep over?
Oh, yeah. So there's like, say, like, there's actually 4 more pieces of wood that I need to finish before I'm done with all of the woodwork. And that is one of them. So the dagger board. And then the other one is like the steering mechanism. Are we taking questions from the audience at this time?
Any audience members have
Isaac?
questions?
What are you got the name your boat?
Oh yeah, I actually thought about that a couple weeks ago. I was like, I don't have a name for this boat yet. I've tossed around a few ideas. I'm not exactly sure what I'm gonna name it, but one idea that I thought sounded cool was First Light. That means a lot to me, especially since I'm a lobsterman. Like, one of the biggest reasons why I love fishing so much is waking up in the morning and just seeing the sunrise. And I know that's very special to a lot of other fishermen too. So.
The name is Sunny.
Sunny?
Any other questions?
Right.
Has the whole process affected like possible career choices, or do you think it'll stay as more of just a hobby?
Well, I mean, I've always known that I've loved woodworking. I think it's just a hobby. I mean, I couldn't see myself like being like a boat builder at like Hinkley or something like that. Just because I don't really like the chemicals and stuff, and I like working outside too. So. Yeah.
But it sounds like you got a good opportunity to spend some time with your dad.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that some of the things that you had done here, coursework, mathematics, and other areas, kind of blended together for you in this project? Were you able to tap into some of those things, mathematics and other areas, or was there some relevance there?
Well, there's actually one thing that was pretty cool that I learned from the book Building Small Boats that I mentioned, and one is this process called galvanic action. It's actually a chemistry concept. Is that when you have 2 different, I can't explain it insanely well because I would probably have to refresh myself, but basically if you have different types of metal that you use for screws or fastenings on your boat and they're underwater, the salt water, since it's like polar, water's polar, and the salt acts as a conductor, it will actually, if the 2 types of metal are like somehow their electrons are arranged in a certain way that they decay each other in the water. So you have to use basically all the same metal for different fastenings, which is pretty cool.
Thank you.